As is the case with anything that makes its way into popular culture, whiskey has a lot of myths surrounding it. So today I want to break down some of those myths. I want to talk about things that are even just misconceptions, not necessarily like big myths, stereotypes that don't really make sense, and just things to be aware of, because this is going to help you when you're in the liquor store, when you're looking at whiskey, when you're trying to figure out which one to buy. Some of these are going to relate directly to that. Some of them are going to relate more to the conversations you have in the whiskey world and the way that you view the whiskey world. So at any rate, I think all of it is actually going to be helpful, most likely. But I'm going to stick to the major ones. I don't want this to be one of those episodes where I'm just like rattling off stuff like a Gatling gun. So I'm just going to stick to the larger myths, the larger things that I see in the world of whiskey, mostly around the fringes of the world of whiskey. Mostly if you're newer to whiskey and if you're not sure about it, then you see a lot more of this stuff because, the people who have been in the culture for a while tend to know it. And so if you're going to talk about it, if you're going to talk whiskey with family and friends and coworkers, you're probably going to want to know these things. And maybe you've even been around for a while and one or two of these you actually weren't aware of. So let's dive into some myths. Before we do that, though, I have to take a moment to ask you to go check out the Patreon page. The Patreon is overwhelmingly helpful, and I hope that you guys know that and that you take seriously when I say how helpful it is, that I truly mean it. It's incredibly helpful. And I also am not asking for a handout. I try to make it so that it's a fair trade. It's like your Netflix subscription, You spend a certain amount of money per month, you get a service in return, and you feel like it's worth it. That's really the goal with the Patreon page. We've added merch for people who sign up now, so now you're going to get merch after a certain number of months. Barrel picks are underway. I've already selected people to go with me to my most recent barrel pick, which by the time you're hearing this is probably over, but you get where I'm going with this. So lots of really fun things on the Patreon page. Just last night, as of the recording of this, we had a really cool monthly virtual meetup, so I got to talk to some of you guys and ask questions live, and everybody was live. So it's not just like a live where you're just in the comments. Like, we're all able to talk to each other. That was a ton of fun. So I'm really excited to get those going more and more as we move on here. But at any rate, the Patreon's super helpful, so thank you so much to everybody who does check it out. Now, let's talk about myths. Let's dive into some of them. This episode is not brought to you by Dr. Shasta, but I wish it was, because this stuff, I love it. It's like one of the cheapest pops you can get if you've ever seen this. They have it at Menards. Anyhow, totally unrelated, but I was just taking a sip of it, and I was like, I don't know if I have to cover this because they're not sponsoring me. I'm going to not worry about it and just disclose that they're not affiliated with this podcast. But if the doctor himself is watching, hit me up. Okay, so let's start diving into some of these myths. First of all, women naturally tend to not like whiskey because it's like a manly thing. It's a man's activity, right? Wrong. I figured I'd just come out of the gate with a heater, right? So the idea that women naturally don't like whiskey is not only a myth. I wouldn't just include that as like a funny, here's a stereotype that's not real. But the reason that I'm including it is actually because the opposite is true. And that's what I find to be hilarious. So not that women are wired more to enjoy whiskey, but that women actually tend to genetically be better at sensing things through taste and smell. So women tend to be better at pulling out flavor notes. Now, this is something that is like anecdotally supported a lot, but I actually even found an article. It was on NPR, and they had an article that was labeled it was "Are Women Better Tasters Than Men?" And it was a whole article about this, and there were some scientific studies done about women's taste receptors and smell receptors, and it just so happens to be, it just turns out that women do tend to be better at tasting whiskey and tasting all sorts of things. They tend to have more sensitive palates, a better ability to pull out specific flavors, specific notes, to detect something in a lower concentration. If I remember correctly, that was how they had done that study, is they like lowered and lowered and lowered the concentration until everybody in the study couldn't smell it anymore, smell it or taste it. And the women tend to do a lot better than the men. So I say all that to say that I just wanted to come out of the gates with one that was a little, I don't know, controversial, but also funny to me because it's the opposite of the fact. So that is not to say that women are going to like whiskey more. And I think that almost goes hand in hand with having the more sensitive palates. I think if they don't get past the burn is going to be extra brutal because you have this really sensitive palate, basically sensitive sense of taste. But I think the flip side of that coin is if you can acquire the taste, well, man, you can just taste way more than a guy could because you have this way more sensitive palate. So it's one of those where it's like it probably about evens out to where if we're talking just in terms of the way people are wired, it's a higher barrier to entry for women, but higher reward because of that sensitive palate. Lower barrier to entry for men because they have a less sensitive palate, but lower reward because they have a less sensitive palate. So, I'm neither here nor there on whether it actually means that you like whiskey more or not. But important thing to know is that women tend to be better at pulling out flavor notes and things like that. So if you're talking conversation with a woman, especially I do this a lot with my wife, I'll have her smell something and I'll be like, "What are you smelling here?" Because she's really good at it. Like she doesn't like the taste of whiskey, but she's really good at smelling it and being like, "Oh, actually, I get a little bit of this," and I'm like, "That was the thing that I was trying to nail down. Thank you so much." So that's a little bit of a fun one, maybe a little controversial to start us off. I promise we're gonna get more specifically into drinking whiskey. I thought that one was interesting. So moving on, ice makes whiskey smoother. Hold on, let me say that one more time. Ice makes whiskey smoother. Okay, I actually had to do that because I might clip that, so I wanted to do it looking directly at the camera. Ice does not make whiskey smoother. That is a myth, and it is the case sometimes, but definitely not all the time. And in my experience, it is less often the case that it makes it smoother. It's more often the case that ice makes it a little bit harsher. For me, for my palate, for my experiences, and also for people that I've talked to about it. A long time ago, I actually don't know when this was. This is definitely sub 100 episodes, probably like sub 50 maybe. We did an episode about like putting ice in whiskey, chilling whiskey, those sorts of things, and we found that it tended to not be as good. Me and the guest, I want to say it was guest noob Bryce, who's actually going to be back here soon. I want to say it was Bryce. We tried stuff together and we both agreed like when you add the ice to it, it's a little bit more harsh. Now what's going on there, right? So I have a couple theories. The first is some whiskeys, when you add water, so forget about temperature and ice for a second. Some whiskeys, when you add water, they get harsher. It just depends on the whiskey. A lot of times when you dilute a whiskey, you're going to be able to see more of the impurities, which is okay if you're releasing it at cask strength and you're like, nobody's ever going to taste this weird flavor that this has anyways, because at cask strength, it has this overwhelming caramel or overwhelming flavor that I'm looking for. But if I dilute it down, now that caramel's diluted and you can taste this other thing. Sometimes that happens. So sometimes when you water down a whiskey, you can see the impurities a lot better and it becomes a lot more harsh. Some whiskeys are made to be at a lower proof and so they don't have those impurities. And maybe if you go to a higher strength, then you notice different things. It all just has to do with how the compounds play out on your palate. But I say all that to say that for that reason alone, forget about temperature for a second. For that reason alone, ice is not always going to make your whiskey smoother, and in a lot of cases, it's actually going to make it harsher because it's going to water down that whiskey. Now, that being said, there's also a temperature element to this, and this is my theory for why I just genuinely do not like my whiskey on ice nearly as much as I like my whiskey neat. And I've perpetuated this before, or I've talked about this before, that there's this kind of stereotype like, well, I'm so tough that I drink my whiskey neat. Like people tend to think that that's what you are saying. That's not what I'm saying. Actually, it's the opposite. I think whiskey is more harsh when I have ice in it, and I just think it's easier and less painful to drink without ice in it. So, my theory for why that is the case is actually because of the temperature change. I think when whiskey's at room temperature and it hits your palate, you're able to taste it pretty well, right? When you cool anything down, this is just known. When you cool something down, you taste it less. It weakens, it's harder for your palate to taste it. Well, because it's getting weaker in terms of flavor, but it still has the alcohol to it, I think it makes it taste harsher. And also, it's not staying cold the whole time you're taking a sip of it, right? Your mouth's going to warm it up. And as your mouth warms it up, I think that just kind of activates the alcohol almost. Like I think that kind of just makes the alcohol pop more because you're feeling it heat up in your mouth, and that's making the fumes come out of it even more. And I just feel like when that happens, that also makes it even harsher, in my opinion, and especially with the fact that you're not tasting it as much. Because like the thing when you're tasting whiskey and it doesn't taste harsh, the thing that's happening is you're tasting the flavor of it and not paying as much attention to the alcohol. Well, if you take away that flavor, you're going to pay more attention to the alcohol. So it all in all, for me, it almost always makes it worse. There are some whiskeys that I would like on ice that I enjoy. I did an episode trying different ones on ice. But mostly for me, it's just a mood thing. If it's really, really hot outside and I really, really want a glass of whiskey, I'll either do a cocktail or I'll do it on ice, of course. Like, I'm not like a psycho. But I do usually prefer it neat. I tend to drink more whiskey in the wintertime, or I drink it more indoors in the summertime. So that's kind of where I'm at with ice. But important detail, because I think it gets overlooked, because I think what happens... Here's just a guess. I think when people are newer to whiskey, everything's really harsh, right? Everything tastes like alcohol. And so they cool it down, and it dulls the alcohol flavor a little bit, and it dulls those other flavors as well, maybe even more. But it at least dulls that alcohol flavor a little bit. Whereas when you learn to taste whiskey, dulling the flavors makes it artificially seem like the alcohol is cranked up. And so that's where it's like, it's one of those things, it's almost like a training wheel or a crutch that would hurt you later on, because you're not learning to taste the flavor notes. You're trying to like kind of put a Band-Aid on it. Now that being said, if you're experienced and you drink whiskey and you don't have a problem tasting flavors and you prefer it on ice, I'm not saying you should not drink it on ice. I think you should do whatever you want to do. I'm going to drink mine neat. You drink yours on ice. That's awesome. You can drink it with Diet Coke if you want. I don't care. But my point is, especially if you're newer and you're trying these different things to try to figure out what makes it smoother, I don't think ice is actually going to help you in the long term. And I think in a lot of cases, ice makes it less smooth. But when you're newer to it, you only ever drink it with ice, so you don't really have a frame of reference. And that is what happened to me a lot early on. And then later on, I came back to it and I'm like, oh, I don't like this at all. Why did I convince myself that I like this? So ice does not always make it smoother. Darker whiskey is always better than lighter whiskey. That's one that you hear a lot. If you're looking for a good whiskey, you look for a dark one, right? There are a lot of reasons that this isn't true, but I'm going to try not to get on too much of a soapbox here, but I'm going to try to break it down for you. So first of all, some whiskeys, Scotch whiskeys, Irish whiskeys, I think Japanese whiskeys, a lot of different types of whiskeys, allow you to add caramel coloring. Now, bourbon does not, and I'm pretty sure American rye does not, if I'm not mistaken, but some whiskeys do. So it might just be artificially darker, right? So like that's the first overwhelmingly, like not obvious if you don't know the rules, but once you know that, overwhelmingly obvious reason that darker is not better. You could take a whiskey that just tastes like Everclear, just tastes disgusting, and you could add coloring into it, and it'll be darker than a lighter whiskey like a Ardbeg that's a light color and actually is really good, really full-bodied. So keep that in mind. The other reason, so if we want to get a little bit more technical here, the other reason that darker is not always better is because what is the darker whiskey? Like, what's making it darker? So let's assume you're not adding any coloring to it. Let's assume that it's just naturally being colored by the wood that it's aged in. If that's the case, the age is going to make it darker. The proof is going to make it darker. And I think a lot of people hear those two and they kind of stop there. And they're like, okay, well, I tend to like higher proof stuff, especially if you're an experienced guy. Or I tend to like older stuff, especially if you're an experienced guy. Although we're going to talk about how older is not always better next. Sneak peek. But you tend to think those two things and you're like, okay, well then darker is better. However, what else affects the darkness of a whiskey? What climate it was aged in, how hot it was while it was aged, how much it's interacting with the wood, what size barrel it's being aged in, how many different barrels it's being aged in. Now, I bring up those other three, and there's more than that, of course, but I bring up those other three because some of those can make it darker and make it taste worse. So just as an example, if something is rapidly aged way too fast, if you took whiskey off of a still, you put it in a really small barrel, so it has a high surface area of wood to volume of whiskey ratio, high ratio of that. You put it in a real small barrel, and you put it in a chamber that heats up every day and cools down every day. That whiskey would get dark really quickly. And then when you pull it out of there, it would taste really, really bitter and tannic. Like it would be one of those whiskeys, most likely. There's lots of variables at play here, but most likely. One of those whiskeys that just dries your mouth out. Boom. You're like, whoa, this tastes like charred. Like I'm licking charred wood and my mouth is dry and it's a little bit miserable. To some extent, as an extreme, that would be a darker whiskey. And so you have to be careful. There are different factors at play than just the darkness. And I fall for this all the time, especially like as a man. I feel like men are more visual. A lot of people say that. And so I see a darker whiskey and it feels more appealing. I'm like, oh, like it's a dark one. It's going to have more flavor, right? It's going to have more body. Maybe. But maybe that body's going to be terrible too. So you have to keep that in mind. Darker is not always better. Sometimes darker could be worse because it could be the result of something that will give you a worse flavor. And that is not to say aging in a warm climate, aging in a small vessel. What was the other one that I said? Aging quickly with different temperature swings, or whatever the other one was that I said. It does not mean that those always lead to bad flavors. It can be done properly, but it just is to say that those are factors that will make it darker and in some cases make it worse. You kind of have to have a skill to be able to do some of those things properly. So that's just a little sidebar there. But also, so as I mentioned, older whiskey is going to tend to be darker. Doesn't that mean it's better? No. So older whiskey is better is a myth as well. That's another one that people just kind of think, oh, well, older is better. To a certain extent, yes, and that's why the myth exists. A lot of these myths you're going to see, they run parallel to the truth. There's a reason that they became myths, right? Older is better if you're drinking a 1 year, a 2 year, a 3 year, and a 4 year. Most of the time, not always, most of the time, the older is going to taste a little bit better. A lot of the times it's not. Sometimes the younger is going to taste really good. A lot of times a younger whiskey will have like this nice light caramel. It gets the vanillins from the oak, and it doesn't get too much tannin from the oak, and then it's nice and it's sweet, and it has some of that alcohol harshness, but it doesn't have some of that tannic harshness, so it just depends. But more importantly, when you get, especially in the United States, especially in warmer climates, when you get beyond 10 years, you can really start to run into some harshness. You can really start to run into some whiskeys that you're like, whoa, like this tastes like I somehow distilled an entire barrel down into one glass and I'm drinking that barrel and it is not pleasant. That can happen as well. So older is not always better. The other reason this kind of gets perpetuated is because over in Scotland and in Ireland, where the climate is a lot more temperate, you can get really, really, really old before you hit those diminishing returns. So you can age it because the temperature doesn't swing very much. So you can age it for a really long time, and it doesn't. The reason the climate swing is important for those who don't know is when it gets hot out, whiskey gets pushed into the wood of the barrel. When it gets cold out, that barrel contracts and squeezes the whiskey out. So think of every temperature swing as like steeping your tea, like it bobbing up and down. Versus if you don't have temperature swings, it's kind of like you set the tea into the hot water and just let it set. It's kind of like that, right? And so in the less temperature changing climates over in Scotland and in Ireland, you can age for a lot longer and see a lot less tannin interaction, see a lot less harshness happen, and also they tend to use used barrels over there, so that even amplifies it even more because they're using barrels that have already aged something. So some of that like raw tannin char that's right there, some of that flavor has already been extracted from the wood, right? So couple of reasons that is a rumor, but that is a fake rumor. So older is not always better for those reasons listed. Once again, there's exceptions to every rule. You can age something and make it just get better and better every year. Some distillers are really good at this. Some, a lot, I would say, maybe the majority, don't really care about this because it's like, well, the longer I have to sit on it, the more money I'm going to lose, right? So some of them just don't care. They want to make a really good 4-year whiskey, and those are most of what I would say I drink. But some distillers are really careful about it. You see this a lot in Scotland. You see them releasing 21-year-old whiskeys. I believe Whistle Pig even released a 30-year-old that was American single malt or North American single malt or something like that. So you can do it, but it is something to keep in mind is that it depends on if it was done properly. Sometimes age statements, and I've seen people compare like Knob Creek and 9-year, 12-year, 15-year, or maybe it's Elijah Craig, like where they compare the different ages and they don't like them after a certain point. A lot of influencers will say that. I've never had beyond Knob Creek 12-year, but I love Knob Creek 12-year. But I could see that being the limit. I could see, once you get above that, it starts to be a little bit too harsh. I used to feel this way about Buffalo Trace and Eagle Rare. My palate has kind of naturally moved towards the more tannic flavors, so I do prefer Eagle Rare now. But back in the day, I kind of just liked that Buffalo Trace was lighter and sweeter. And if you don't know this, Eagle Rare and Buffalo Trace are the same mash bill. Eagle Rare is older in different barrels. They select different barrels. But that was one of the reasons that I tended towards Buffalo Trace. Or at the very least, I was like, Eagle Rare is not worth the extra money to me. I'm going to stick to Buffalo Trace. Now I enjoy Eagle Rare, but it's also hard to find, so I don't worry too much about it. But that was just a convenient example. Yes, this next one is where the pitchforks might come out. Flavor notes are totally subjective, based totally on your taste buds. Okay, I am saying that this is a myth, to be clear. But there's a huge subjective component to flavor notes that I want to make clear, right? And my biggest fear with featuring this myth is people being afraid to say flavor notes, because flavor notes are subjective enough that you can almost say whatever you want and people probably aren't going to disagree with you. I mean, if you're drinking a really old oaky bourbon and you say like, I don't even know what would be a bad one, but okay, if you're drinking a really young whiskey and you say like dark, deep, charred notes, people might be like, okay, well, I don't see that. But I'd say like 99% of the time, you can almost say whatever you want, and people are just going to accept it because they're going to be like, well, maybe they're tasting that. Their taste buds are different than mine. So flavor notes are very subjective. The reason I bring this up is flavor notes are not totally subjective, okay? So you see this a lot, especially in like the TikTok era, where it's like, I don't care what anybody says, I know that this whiskey is trash. And you see that a lot with a video that's trying to be catchy and trying to be a hot take, and it's not really their honest opinion a lot of the times. And I'm not calling out anybody specific. I saw this a lot more back in the day, so like I don't even remember the type of person who was saying things like this or what accounts it might have been. But I say all this to say that what you prefer might be subjective, but the notes there's some objectivity to it. So what I mean is there's some objectivity to this has a lot of alcohol flavor with not a lot of other flavor. There's some objectivity there. To some extent, everybody should get a trend for that, right? Otherwise, we would just never trust any review of any whiskey ever. Same goes for food, right? It's the same taste buds tasting the whiskey versus the food. We would just be like, well, I can't trust what anybody says about food because it's all completely subjective. So we can't just throw everything out the window for subjectivity. There is an aspect of this that is objective. And then also just like with what types of notes you're getting. So sometimes if you're drinking a whiskey and it's lots of caramels, vanillas, brown sugars, lots of those types of flavors, then you should see that a little bit in most reviews across the board. And the reason this is important to me is you can trust reviews, especially ones that align with that. Reviews that say like, if you see multiple different people saying I get this or that from it, and even if it's not the exact same thing, it's similar, then you can probably trust that that's going to be a major flavor in the whiskey. This is also really helpful for training your palate. If you don't have anything to go off of, if you can't trust anyone or what they think about anything, then you can't really train your palate. But if you find a reviewer who you trust and you think, yeah, they're really doing, every time they say something, I agree with them, you can then train your palate. You can then say, okay, what did this person say about this whiskey? Now I want to try it and I want to look for those things. And don't get too caught up in it. Try to come up with your own notes. Try to enjoy it in your own way. But I say all that to say that it's not totally subjective. I think sometimes we're really quick to just throw the baby out with the bathwater and be like, well, it's subjective, so nothing of what anybody says matters. And that also opens the floodgates for people to be like, yes, this is a cocktail cherry that actually sat on black pavement for 3 weeks and then had a little bit of cinnamon sprinkled on it, but then it was washed off with a fire hose and then dipped in honey. It's just like, okay, what are we doing here? Like we're opening the floodgates to stuff like that. So that's why I bring that one up. But important to have that balance. It's subjective enough you can pretty much say whatever you want, but it's objective enough that you can pretty much trust other people. You just have to use your rationality there when you're looking at that stuff. Okay, let's keep moving down the line here. Whiskey never goes bad. Wine goes bad very quickly, but whiskey actually doesn't go bad. You can just keep it forever. That is a myth, okay? That one is a dangerous myth because I have lost good bottles to that. Not a full bottle, obviously, which is what we're about to talk about, but half-empty bottles. So whiskey does go bad after a certain period of time. Now, if you never open the bottle, if it's still perfectly sealed, odds are the amount of time that it will last will be an extremely long time. Like, it will last a very long time. Probably the cork will rot out of it, will dry out and rot into the bottle before the whiskey actually goes bad. Like, that might be the cause of it going bad. But the whiskey itself is probably going to be fine. After you open it, anywhere between a full bottle and like 3/4, it's going to last a super long time. I wouldn't worry about it. Excuse me. Anywhere between 3/4 and a half of a bottle, it's going to last probably at least half of a year, maybe a full year. Really depends on the whiskey. This is another one of those things where it depends on which whiskey it is that we're talking about. But all that being said, it will go bad around that time period. Once you get below half a bottle, I tend to try to make it less than 6 months if I can. This is where it can really start to come off the rails, and it's hard to know. Every bottle's different. Every whiskey is different, depending on the proof point, depending on the shape of the bottle, how much air to whiskey ratios in the bottle. Those sorts of things are going to change it. But most importantly, what's going to happen is it's probably not going to be harmful in any way. It's probably not going to expire in the same way that food expires, but it will degrade in flavor eventually. So let's just go to the extreme and say that you leave 1 glass of a whiskey in a bottle. So you've got like 1.5 ounces of whiskey in this bottle, and you leave it for 6 months. Odds are, maybe even let's make it more extreme, 1 year. Odds are, when you come back to it, it's going to have a real harsh taste to it. The whiskey is going to interact with the oxygen, because even though you got the cork in there, there's so much oxygen has made it into that bottle from it being mostly empty versus the amount of whiskey. It's got plenty of oxygen to just keep reacting with that whiskey, okay? And so that's going to oxidize the whiskey, which to some extent can be good. If you've got a brand new bottle and you pour it into a glass, sometimes you want to give it a swirl or two and oxidize it a little bit. But over a year of just sitting there with that, a lot of times you are going to very, very quickly pass the point of diminishing returns, and then you're going to end up getting into territory where it's getting worse. And a lot of times that worse, quote unquote, is going to be a little bit more harsh, a little bit more alcohol, a little bit more like paint thinner, like chemically. That's what I've had experience before. And I also had that happen with a bottle of Russell's 10-year by accident, completely by accident. And I went to review it. I was doing a review video of it, and I think I left it like probably 1/4 of a bottle for like, let's say, a year. And I went maybe 6 months. I went to review it, and I'm doing the review, and I'm like, this is so much worse than I remembered. Like, I kind of enjoyed this. I'm not a huge Russell's 10 person anyways, but in the review, I'm like, this is really bad. I never published the review because later I was like, oh my gosh, I bet I let it sit too long. So like, this doesn't make sense. I really, really don't like this right now. And it had just sat too long and oxidized, and it became really harsh. So whiskey does go bad eventually. The next myth that we have here: water makes whiskey better. That is a myth for reasons stated earlier on. I'm not going to beat that dead horse, but basically, sometimes it does. Sometimes it reveals issues. Sometimes it reveals better flavors. It just depends. So water is a great way to see your whiskey from a different perspective and get an idea of whether or not you like that whiskey watered down, whether you like it higher proof, whether it has impurities when you water it down. It's just a different perspective. It's just like looking at a painting under different lighting. You know, you might look at it under one lighting and you're like, wow, this looks great. You look at it under a different lighting and you're like, this either looks better or it looks worse. It just depends. So that's the way I like to think of it. Or the other way I've put it before is if you're looking at like a 3D sculpture, it's like moving to a different side of the sculpture. Like you're looking at the same thing, but you're seeing it from a different perspective. So that's the way to use water, but it does not always make it better. Okay, yeah, this is another one. This kind of came up already, but let's talk about it. You can rapid age whiskey and make it taste just as good as if you were to age it longer. That is a myth as well, for reasons stated previously. There is something about aging longer in a more temperate climate. I don't know the science behind this, but it just introduces less of a tannic flavor versus rapidly aging. So this can also be more than just where it's aged at. This can be throwing aging spirals or aging wood chips into your whiskey at home in order to try to rapidly age it. You know, you buy a 4-year whiskey, you throw a bunch of wood chunks into it, and it's going to make it taste like a 10-year whiskey after a couple of weeks. Not necessarily. A lot of times it's not at all. That was a very common myth that got perpetuated by a really popular TikTok video a couple years ago. And it does work in some whiskeys, and a lot of times times, especially if you like oaky flavors, it will make it taste better. Those little like aging spirals and things like that, to an extent. And then it's going to start making it taste worse. I did a 2 or 3 month long experiment where I double oaked Buffalo Trace in a small mini barrel, and it got better and better and better, and then very quickly got worse. Like week 5, it got better. Week 5.5, it was like okay, and then week 6, it was worse. And so it'll quickly change. So you can rapid age whiskey to some extent, but you are almost never going to get that same result that you would get from properly aging whiskey. So the way that we tend to do it right now tends to be 50-gallon barrels, or 53 or whatever the exact amount is, and that gives you a certain surface area of the barrel to a certain volume of whiskey, and that tends to work really well, in my opinion, in Kentucky, the Kentucky climate, for about 10 years, 12 years, depends on where you're at in the rick house, things like that, but it tends to work around there. You can't just use a smaller barrel in more extreme climate and get there quicker. But it will change different properties of the whiskey, so there's fun things you can do with it, but it's not equivalent, which is what I'm trying to get across. Last but most certainly not least, you cannot get a proper taste of whiskey if you're using a spittoon rather than swallowing the whiskey. This is one, if you've commented this on my videos, I see you. I see you commenting it. I see you continually perpetuating it. And I understand where it comes from. I used to kind of think this. I used to kind of be like, well, sure, you can use a spittoon, and it's probably not a huge difference, but it's not the same. You're not getting a good taste of that whiskey. I've totally changed my mind about that. I do. The majority of my weekday tastings these days are all with a spittoon. That is what I do most of my tastings with. And it takes practice. I think that's where people lose it, is it's not as simple as doing it as like drinking the whiskey. But if you practice, you can get to where I can do a tasting with a spittoon and I know what the flavor notes of that whiskey are. And it's honestly not as much more difficult as you would think. It's one of those where it's just like practice makes perfect. Like you just have to figure out how to move it around your mouth a little bit better, how to make sure your whole palate's getting coated, how to focus on that finish even though you spit it out instead of swallowing it. Yeah, I know people could clip this video up if they wanted to and it would be really bad. But anyways, all that is to say, you can do tastings with spittoons and still taste everything. And the big thing, this is my point when you're commenting that you can't get a proper review of a whiskey if you're using a spittoon. Most reviewers are doing this. So most of the spirits tasting competitions, they're not just blacking out to do this competition. They're using spittoons. They're tasting it with a spittoon. A lot of times when you do a barrel pick, you're going to use a spittoon. A lot of times when you go to a distillery and you work with a blender or you talk with a blender or they walk you through a tasting, they're going to have a spittoon there for you. If you're blending, like master blenders, the people who we in this industry put at the very top of their craft, who are so good at picking out the flavors of whiskey, a lot of times they're using spittoons. So all that is to say, spittoons do not ruin the flavor of whiskey. And I can understand why you might think that, but if you get good, it's just like with anything. If you practice it, you flex that muscle, you can get really good at doing tastings with spittoons, which is what I do most of the time. Because most of my review videos, my review podcasts, my review YouTube videos, those all have to occur during the day on a weekday for me now. And so I have to make sure that I'm not just getting drunk on the middle of a weekday. Otherwise, it would literally be almost every day. And so I have to be very careful with that. Now, another like word of caution is you do still get a little bit of alcohol using a spittoon. I've heard of people doing it and saying they're not getting any alcohol at all and that it doesn't affect them. And maybe if you have the proper technique and you're really rinsing your mouth out with water or whatever, you might be okay. But just be aware, you are probably still getting a little bit of alcohol, even if you're using a spittoon. But don't be afraid to use them at home, even. Like if you're like trying to just do a blind tasting and you're trying to just learn something about whiskey, there's not really a reason that you have to drink it. You're still doing the thing that is enjoyable, in my opinion. Like, you're still doing the meditative, focusing on the flavors, focusing on the art, focusing on the whiskey and the craft and how good it is, why this one tastes more like this versus the other one. You're still doing all that, so don't be afraid to use a spittoon there. I know it's a little bit gross, but you get used to it so quickly. I have a reusable one that I use now. It's a glass bottle, and I just dump it down the toilet, flush it with a whole bunch of water, and then clean it out with soap and water, and it's fine. It's something that you get used to relatively quickly. Okay, I'm sure that there are more myths out there, but those are the ones that I decided to cover in this episode. Hopefully you guys liked it. Hopefully you learned at least something from it, or if not, got a little bit of a refresher, or maybe even you knew this was a myth, but you didn't know why. You didn't know the counterexamples that I gave. So hopefully that is the case. But I wanted to get this out there, and I might even cover more. I probably am going to start this on Reels, just covering myths like regularly, because there's a lot out there and it's easy for misinformation to accidentally get perpetuated. I'm sure I have perpetuated misinformation about whiskey plenty of times. So that's why I kind of want to just get more of these myths out there in the open and let people know that it's usually not just, well, the opposite of this myth is true. It's usually like there's some truth and there's some untruth, and here's how you use that practically, right? Here's how you use that when you go to a liquor store when you're talking to somebody. Okay, we actually don't have any Q&As in this episode, but if you are a patron, don't forget you can submit Q&As through the Discord. That is the Discord chat. That is Q&A. It's labeled that. And if you want to submit questions in the Q&A, go ahead and join the Patreon. Any tier, and you get to submit questions, which I love answering, so feel free to go submit some. But I cranked out this episode kind of quickly this time around to get a quick turnaround, because I'm traveling next week. You didn't need all that information, but I gave it to you anyways. Thank you guys all for listening to this episode of Whiskey Noobs. I'll leave you with learn to drink to learn. Hi there. Since you're still here, I'm going to assume that you enjoyed the show, in which case, please just take a moment to leave a 5-star rating or review on whatever platform it is that you get your podcast from. Subscribe to the podcast because that actually really helps out. And also, if you're on YouTube, ring that notification bell. If you really like this show, though, the best way that you can support it is just checking out that Patreon page. It's at the description in the show notes or in the description on YouTube, or you can go to patreon.com/whiskeynoobs. That is the absolute best way to support the show, but also just spreading the word to other people who you think might be interested. I am so grateful for all of the forms of support that you guys give. And please, 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 most importantly, always drink responsibly. Thank you guys all so much. And in case nobody else tells you today, I got to tell you, God bless.